Now on 4, Sign On, Newswatch. This is the edition which, due to technical difficulties, we were unable to show last week. The advertised programme about the deaf people of Guinea will be shown next Saturday.
Hello and welcome to the first Newswatch of our new series. This week, even Tory MPs were casting doubts on the leadership of John Major. But it's only the latest flare-up in what had already been a bad year for the Prime Minister. He says he wants to get back to basics, but every time he tries to explain what he means by that, one of his colleagues seems to do something that contradicts what John Major is preaching.
And on March the 9th, about 2,000 people with disabilities, including a large contingent of deaf people from all over Britain, came to the Houses of Parliament to tell Mr Major and every other MP that they weren't getting their most basic civil rights.
Later in the programme, we'll be seeing what some of the deaf people there had to say. But first, back to Mr Major. Last October, at the Conservative Party conference, he tried to hit back at those who said his leadership was weak and lacking direction. He called for a return to what he called common sense policies, and he promised
The Conservative Party will lead the country back to basics right across the board. Sound money, free trade, traditional teaching, respect for the family and the law. It is time to return to the old core values, time to get back to basics, to self-discipline and respect for the law, to consideration for others, to accepting responsibility for yourself and your family.
But Mr Major's stand on family values had already been undermined. Last July, he was overheard referring to 3 of his own cabinet colleagues as bastards.
For the rest of 1993, Mr Major had mixed fortunes. In December, the Downing Street Declaration on a peace settlement in Northern Ireland was seen as a personal triumph for him. Unemployment was down, and there seemed to be an economic recovery underway. But he was still having trouble, particularly with the House of Lords, who inflicted 3 defeats on the government's rail privatisation bill. This trouble continued into 1994. The House of Lords forced the government to make changes to its plans to reform the police and the magistrates' courts. One of the cabinet ministers Mr Major was thought to have called a bastard was the Treasury Minister Michael Portillo. Mr Portillo may have thought he was supporting the Prime Minister's appeal to traditional values in a speech he made in February. He claimed that standards in other countries were lower than in Britain, but it led to an immediate row. The Labour Party said his remarks made him unfit for high office, and even in his own party there were worries about the effect on our relations with other countries.
It was in a speech to students at Southampton that Michael Portillo made the remarks. He was repeating a call he's made before for a greater pride in Britain. But his comparisons with other countries took on a strident anti-foreign tone when he seemed to imply that just about every other country was corrupt.
If any of you in this room have got an A-level, it is because you've got an A-level, because you've worked to get it and you were given it. You go to any other country and you've got an A-level because you bought it, or because you were a friend of the minister. When you go into business, you will win contracts because you are good at what you do. You go to a number of other countries and you would win contracts because your cousin was a minister or because you've lined the pocket of some public official. You know.
Mr. Portillo quickly expressed regret for what he'd said.
Oh, yes, not only do I regret it, I moved at once to set the record straight. There was a journalist present, and I said, obviously, I didn't mean it quite in the way that it came out. I was making a point about standards of life in Britain. In the heat of the moment, on the spur of the moment, I exaggerated what I said. The basic point remains, and every now and again, people do say a little bit more than they mean on the spur of the moment.
Even before Mr. Portillo's speech, what other colleagues had been doing in the heat of the moment had already created an incredible series of embarrassments for the government.
In January, the Environment Minister Tim Yeo became the latest government minister to resign after a sex scandal. It was revealed he had fathered a child last July by a Tory councillor who was not his wife. But scandal soon combined with tragedy. The wife of Transport Minister Lord Caithness shot herself dead because of her husband's affair with another woman. Lord Caithness, too, resigned.
But it was the death of a rising parliamentary star that probably caused the greatest shock. Stephen Milligan, a new MP in John Major's general election victory in 1992, was found dead in his kitchen. He was wearing only a pair of women's stockings and a suspender belt. Other details suggested he may have strangled himself while performing a bizarre sexual experiment. It happened in February. Mr. Major was just about to launch a new attempt to get his back-to-basics ideas across to the voters.
The Prime Minister is in Leicester tonight at the start of his new campaign to take his message to the country. Officially, he's said to be in very good heart, but friends say the Milligan affair has shaken him badly. As it has all MPs, and especially Tory members, who heard this official announcement today.
I regret to have to inform the House of the death of Stephen David Wyatt Milligan, Esquire.
Outside, newspaper headlines only seem to reinforce last week's Gallup poll finding that 64% of those questions thought the government to be very sleazy. Conservative hands, both old and not so old, are gloomy.
Clearly, the government is held in poor esteem. You only have to look at the opinion polls, and I think that they do fairly reflect the standing of the government. And I doubt if that will be reversed until the recovery in the economy has proceeded for some months more.
This is a tragedy which could have happened in any political party or indeed in any organisation, and I think the public will take that view.
But since Christmas, when the headlines spoke of Tim Yeo's love child, the bad news has been relentless. The tragic death of Lady Caithness, the bizarre story of Tory MP David Ashby and his share-a-bed French holiday, news of Alan Duncan's house purchasing arrangements, and the revelations of gerrymandering by Westminster City Council. To all of that must be added a damning report on the misuse of public funds, Lord Justice Scott's inquiry into arms sales to Iraq, and what appears to be a growing scandal over the Pergau Dam contract in Malaysia, all of which adds up to a catalogue of government mishaps, bad luck and bad timing. And all of that, Mr. Major believes, has helped to obscure the message he is trying to get across, the process made worse by the hothouse atmosphere of Westminster and the London press. And that is one reason why Mr. Major has been so keen to escape to what he sees as the purer political air of the rest of the country.
Since then, there have been more sex scandals concerning Tory MPs. The Scott inquiry into the sale of arms to Iraq before the Gulf War, possibly with the knowledge of government ministers, is still going on. And it was a reference to that by another government minister, which caused the Prime Minister some embarrassment last month. William Waldegrave has been called the Minister for Open Government, which means, for example, telling the public the truth. But in March, he seemed to say to a parliamentary select committee that there were times when it was all right for government ministers to lie to the House of Commons.
Mr. Waldegrave's comments come at a sensitive time, with the government under investigation over the Pergau Dam affair and over arms to Iraq, in which he himself is closely involved. It was the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robin Butler, who landed Mr. Waldegrave in difficulties with a statement that in the most exceptional circumstances, ministers could mislead Parliament. The Minister for Open Government found himself justifying to the Select Committee the right of ministers on those occasions to lie to members of Parliament.
What Sir Robin was saying, that in exceptional cases, and I imagine he was using, as he did believe before the Scott inquiry, the example of devaluation, which I don't think anyone would doubt, it is necessary to say something that is untrue to the House of Commons. The House of Commons understands that and has always accepted it.
But if the Scott inquiry criticised you for misleading the House, would you feel it incumbent on you to resign?
It would depend entirely on the seriousness of the criticism.
But in the end, it's usually very basic issues that really decide the fate of governments. The economy, law and order, education, the National Health Service, the things that affect people's everyday lives. And that was why people with disabilities and deaf people converged on London last month to say that in all these areas, they are not getting a fair deal. Join us after the break to see what they had to say.
I can't believe we're here.
What's that? We should have left this stuff.
Well, let's do it.
Have a nice day.
Okay, so let's leave it all.
Who is this?
No, Tony's flat.
What, my Tony?
The Peugeot 106. Leave it all behind. Find a house. Put in an offer. Find a solicitor. Put in a sensible offer. Get a good mortgage. Get a survey. Negotiate the price again. Exchange contracts. Move in. Enjoy. The Midland Guide to First-Time Buying. Available from your nearest branch.
The Wilkinson Sword Protector. So sharp, it has to be kept behind bars. Protective guard wires ensure that while the shave is close, there is no safer wet shave.
But what a man needs even more.
The safest wet shave ever from Wilkinson Sword.
And as to your claim that you could not afford motor insurance, I can only say...
If you're looking for a good deal on motor insurance, there's one company that comes highly recommended. Call Direct Line on 021 236 2468.
In the past 12 years, there have been 12 attempts to introduce a law that will ban discrimination against people with disabilities. Last month saw the 13th attempt. Roger Berry's Civil Rights Disabled Persons Bill not only seeks to end discrimination, but to give certain legal rights that will make it easier to obtain a better place in society. On March the 9th, 2 days before the bill was due for its second reading in the House of Commons, there was a mass lobby to persuade members of Parliament to support the bill.
If you watched ITN's early evening news, the BBC's 6 o'clock news, the 9 o'clock news, or news at 10, you wouldn't have seen anything about it. But Channel 4 News did carry an excellent report presented by Angie Carmichael, who herself has a disability. Now's your chance to see it interpreted by a deaf person.
Around 2,000 disabled people from all over Britain converged on the Commons today. They were trying to persuade MPs to turn out on Friday and keep alive Roger Berry's bill giving civil rights to disabled people. It would make it illegal to discriminate against people because of their disability. And it would set up a disability commission along the same lines as the Commission for Racial Equality. The government says they're not against the bill, but they believe the best way forward is education, not legislation. There are 6.5 million disabled people in Britain. They are discriminated against every day, directly through lack of opportunities at school and in the workplace, indirectly through poor access to public buildings and transport. Unlike women and ethnic minorities, disabled people have no legal comeback against discrimination.
Hello, Even Coalition of Disabled People.
Wendy Lee is a highly qualified secretary. She knows from bitter experience that prejudice about her blindness puts most employers off. Government figures show that disabled people are 3 times more likely to be out of work. When they do get a job, it's likely to be poorly paid and low skilled.
There was one interview which I went for. The man took me into the interview room and he said, I had to interview you because you had so many qualifications. Had you not had those qualifications because of your blindness, I wouldn't even have looked at you, given you a second look. That's the outright discrimination that happens a lot for disabled people applying for jobs and in jobs.
David Birtwistle has learning difficulties. He's studying food hygiene at a college in Bristol. In his first and only job so far, he was falsely accused of stealing a wallet and beaten up by his workmates. He took them to court and won to get compensation for his bruises and to fight the assumption that disabled people are easy targets.
Some people just walk past you and call you spastic or idiot. Look at them idiots coming in. They always pick on someone who's got learning difficulties. Why can't they pick on somebody that's not got learning difficulties? Why pick on us?
Disability activists say people like David are regularly thrown out of restaurants and shops, often because staff believe their appearance upsets other customers.
All white without, okay.
And wheelchair users can be banned from restaurants, cinemas and theatres because staff believe they are a fire risk.
It's not just about people not talking to you directly or about people not liking disabled people. It's about the whole institution of society, the way society is managed. It's rather the same as it has been for women in the past and for ethnic minorities. And we need to break that down.
Improving transport is one of the main barriers to break down. Only 2 wheelchair users at one time can get on an intercity train. The London Underground is almost impossible, and in this country at least, buses are out of the question too. The chairman of the Commons All-Party Disablement Group is now convinced that what is needed is comprehensive civil rights legislation.
Well, I think it's very important now to take the step which the Americans have already taken to remove the possibility of discrimination. Some years ago, I was not a believer in the need to have legislation of this sort, but in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been finding that more and more in attending meetings of disabled organizations that all the barriers which existed 10 or 15 years ago are still there.
The Minister for Disabled People, Nicola Scott, believes implementing the Civil Rights Bill would cost billions. In a statement for Channel 4 News, he said, the comprehensive legislation proposed would potentially result in expensive litigation and massive costs to the taxpayer, business and consumer. Yesterday in the Commons, however, the Prime Minister said MPs should be given the chance to examine Roger Berry's bill in detail.
We share the aim of eliminating discrimination against disabled people. We have put in place a number of measures to do that. Of course, we will examine his honourable friend's bill carefully. There will be a debate on Friday. I hope after that debate, the bill will be able to go into committee for a detailed examination of the bill, what it would achieve, what it would mean, what it would cost, and those parts of it that are appropriate.
I think if we look at the what's happened in the States with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we see that an enormous amount can be done at relatively little cost. And I might say, I think it's about time we took into account the costs of discrimination to disabled people, something the government seems to forget.
Of the 2,000 lobbyists on March the 9th, it's reckoned about 600 were deaf. Sign-on cameras were there to record what some of them had to say.
I haven't met my MP yet. I'm still waiting. Well, I'm here to lobby against discrimination. I'm deaf. I'm also black. So I suffer double oppression. Some hearing white people are given places all right. So what about me? I feel I suffer more. I want to get equality to give me more confidence.
Well, in the past, deaf children grew up with an oral education and they had no rights to change to using BSL. We need to have rights for deaf children. They should have them, just like hearing children. That's what we want, and we need to support that. I have a deaf daughter who grew up with an oral education system, and she needed full BSL. Now she's proud to be deaf. But in the past, they had no rights, and we do need to have them.
This is my third visit, and I hope the bill will finally be passed, because there's a law against sex discrimination and all sorts of other things, but as for education, nothing. I'm a student myself, and I feel it's a real burden to have to get interpreters and pay for them from my grant. It's affecting my work. I'd like it to become an act so that the university would provide interpreters and leave me with a free mind, equal to my hearing counterparts. I don't want the responsibility.
I work at Springfield Hospital as a deaf advisor. I see a lot of deaf patients who have problems. I know what's happened in their family backgrounds, at school. They've suffered discrimination at work, become ill and depressed. It's good today to see such a large crowd here in support, because I know about those problems. The government doesn't look at our problems. I want them to be looked at and solved so that those patients can be helped to get better, with proper care and support, better jobs, communication and all those things they need.
3 years ago, the lobbying failed, but now sign language has moved on. There's been a lot more talk, bus passes. Things have improved for deaf and disabled and blind people, so there's hope. There's an unprecedented turnout of disabled, blind and deaf people here to really press it home to our MPs. So I hope we'll have good luck and we'll win this time. Fingers crossed.
It's difficult to say if the bill will be passed. This morning I received a letter from my MP. My constituency is Southsea. He's a Conservative MP. He says he won't come for the vote on Friday because he feels strongly that the bill won't be passed. It'll fail. That's what he says. But for me and many others, we hope it'll be lucky this time.
So, with so much optimism, how would things go on Friday, March the 11th? 2 hearing signers decided they would go to the second reading to give access to deaf people. We asked one of them, Douglas Silas, to tell us what happened.
Well, on the Wednesday, they had the lobby at the Houses of Parliament. Crowds flocked there, and I went along just to have a look and support the bill. I asked an MP, "You've got interpreters here today, but what happens on Friday morning when you have the debate about the bill? Will he provide interpreters then?" He said no. I said, "Really? But why not?" He said, "Well, there's a law against it." I said, "What happens if I just go and interpret quietly? Will that be all right?" He said, "Well, okay, but you've got to be careful." Anyway, I went home and contacted the RNID and asked them, "Is it possible that you could persuade the Houses of Parliament to allow interpreters?" And they did. I also contacted just to get tickets. I got 6 tickets. And I contacted Darren Townsend Hanscom, the other interpreter, and asked him if he'd come down with me to interpret. We both rang around and asked if deaf people wanted to come. Well, we had 6 deaf people, and that meant we needed 2 extra tickets. Anyway, on Friday morning, we arrived at the Houses of Parliament. I asked, "Is it possible for 2 more tickets?" And they gave with no problem. We all went upstairs into what's called the Strangers' Gallery, where the seats are banked quite highly. The 2 interpreters placed themselves at the bottom, looked up, and interpreted. From about 9:30 to about 2 o'clock, we just carried on interpreting. And I was really surprised because there were some deaf people outside queuing up who just waited
and came in without realising there were going to be interpreters there. When they saw them, they were gobsmacked. It was brilliant. It was quite an emotional time. Anyway, at about 2 o'clock, it was time for the vote. There was support for both the ayes and the noes. And I was surprised because that meant there was a split division and meant that the MPs had to put their names down on the register. We had to wait for 10 minutes and it was quite nerve-wracking. Anyway, when the vote came, the ayes were 231 and the noes were none. It was brilliant. Deaf people wanted to erupt, but I had to say, no, don't do that. You've got to be quiet. You're not allowed to talk.
There are still a number of stages to go through before the bill will become an act, so nobody should get too carried away. But this time, the chances of legislation that will benefit all deaf people do look more positive than ever before.
And that is basically it for this week. Newswatch will be back on Saturday, May the 7th. Next week, Rachel Bastiker will be here with Deaf World and a look at the struggle of deaf people to achieve their basic rights in the West African country of Guinea. Join us for that.